If you're a backpacker, independent traveller, or more experienced safari goer, you might be considering your accommodation options for your next visit to Kenya. This article offers advice about the different types of accommodation and whether it is better to stay in a nearby town when visiting the national parks. The answer does somewhat depend on your definition of better. In terms of quality, usually it is not better, but in terms of cost, it usually is. My recommendation is to stay outside the park, but close to the gate, where you can usually find campsites and cheaper lodges than inside the park, but still you can enjoy the convenience of being at the park. For many backpackers and independent travellers, better can often mean cheaper. So let's start with that as a definition to decide the best place to stay. Although the cost of the accommodation in the towns will be lower than accommodation inside the parks, you also need to factor in the cost of transport between the town accommodation and the park. Sometimes camping is preferable to dingy local guest houses, and it can be the same price. Camping inside the parks is expensive, but at most parks in Kenya, there are campsites close to the park gates that have good amenities, including cold beer, for around $6 to $10 per person per night. Aside from cost, there are more experiential definitions of better to decide whether to stay. Guest houses in town can offer a deeper insight into local culture, and if you get lucky with your fellow guests, it can be a very good experience. You have more freedom to explore when you are close to the action. You can go out to find a local restaurant and again have a more local experience with your meals. Public transport to the towns in Kenya is readily available, so getting to your accommodation in a town is easier. To counter these positive aspects, there are some other things to consider. Local guest houses are often co-located with a restaurant and bar, so it can be quite noisy at night, especially if there's a big football game on. They also may not have the quality of facilities that we might expect at home. While the overall cleanliness might look okay, the attention to detail is often lacking. Many local establishments have squat toilets or even just a hole in the ground. If there is a toilet, there is often not a toilet seat. On the coast, you'll be hard-pressed to find a hot water shower, and inland the hot water showers are electric, so you have to remember to flick the switch to get hot water. If mosquito nets are provided, they often have holes in them. Because most travellers do stay closer to the park, you also need to be prepared to be stared at in town, as you will be a novelty, especially women. If your priority for visiting that area is to see the wildlife in the park, then it is far more convenient to stay inside the park or just outside the gate, rather than in a nearby town. Realistically, the closest towns are just not that close. For Masai Mara, you would be staying in Narok, which is 2 hours away on a corrugated road, and for Samburu, you would be looking for somewhere to stay in Isiolo, which is over half an hour away. If you do want to stay in a local guest house, then I suggest doing as much research as you can. Sites like TripAdvisor may not be so useful for small local places, so you're probably better asking people who have been before, perhaps expats or Kenyans in Nairobi who have to travel to that area for work. It will help to find out the types of people who frequent that accommodation. Is it geared towards business travellers or bus and truck drivers? And if there is anything to be especially aware of. For example, some guest houses act as the local brothel, which is only known to the locals and not to unwitting tourists. Even if you prefer travelling independently, when visiting national parks in Kenya, it is often easier to go with a tour operator who can cater to your budget and needs. Your safety and security is much higher with an operator, and their knowledge of the accommodation options means you have more choices available to you. But if you still prefer to go it alone, then hopefully this article has provided you with more awareness about the advantages and disadvantages of different accommodation options.